Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to kick off our webinar. So just do a quick introduction. Hi, I'm Isaac from the Locofy team. I'm working very closely with the community, so you might have seen me on our community Slack channel. Right now, today, I'm going to be conducting the webinar for you. Today's topic is a very commonly and hotly requested one, which is Figma best practices for high quality code with Locofy. So I'm just going to jump straight into the agenda for today. So right before we begin, I'll be giving a very quick introduction of the Locofy plugin for those who are new to our plugin. Then, as you can see, we are going to be jumping into the best practices and starting from some micro items. So we'll look at the basic building blocks, things like images, text, and a couple of simpler items like buttons and inputs. Then we'll move out a little bit and discuss the best practices for building a couple of bigger components, things like cards, headers, in a scalable manner. Finally, we'll go up into macro and look at the best practices at how to structure your overall designs. All right, so afterwards, we will also have a couple of tips on layer naming for better code. And finally, we have a Q&A section at the end. So if you do have any questions right now, you can actually start to drop them inside the Q&A box, and we'll be tackling a couple of these at the end of the session. So I see a couple of questions being asked. I'll be getting to those in a minute at the end of the session. All right, cool. So let's get started off with the webinar. I'm going to be doing a quick introduction of the Locofy plugin. So for those who are new to Locofy, this is a design that we have designed over here inside of Figma. And as you can see, this design might take maybe about half a week to a week in order to convert into code if you do it all by hand. So what Locofy does is that it's going to help you to take this down to about half a day to a day. So I'm going to be showing you. Currently, Locofy lives as a plugin inside of Figma. So I've opened up the plugin over here. And now I'm going to be showing you a little bit about the Locofy plugin. As you can see, we have a couple of widgets over here. So right now you can see we have tagging of layers. This is the most important feature of Locofy and will help you to make things interactive, add styling and layouts, as well as actions. We also have pre-built components, and this is going to help you with a new design. You can easily work with popular UI libraries. Next, we have preview, which gives you a live interactive preview. So I'm actually going to just click on that right now and show you what we see over here. And this is a live preview that's already running on code. So for this design, I have already Locofied it ahead of time and applied some Locofy settings. So you'll notice that here, because it's a fully interactive live preview, I can stretch and shrink this design. And you can see that is working beautifully in responsiveness. And over here, you can see we have things like working maps, working drop downs, buttons, and so on. Right. So all of this was actually done thanks to tagging. So you can see here, without tagging, it's going to look like this, just a box with text inside. That doesn't work. Whereas with tagging, you can see that we might have something like this, which is a working button with hover effects. In addition, you can see we have this input field design here. So this is one that has not been tagged, and this is one that has been tagged. So we'll be jumping a little bit into tagging a little bit later on. And for responsiveness, which we have just seen, this is covered in our previous webinar. So you can check that out as well. And for today, we are actually going to be focusing on covering some of the best practices. So why do we need to follow some of the best practices in the design? So here you can see that we have the design, and there might be a similar design that looks the same, but the code output is actually going to be different. This is due to the way that you might actually structure your design, apply constraints, or name your layers in different ways, and more. So Locofy plugin actually aims to stay as close as possible to your design intention. And Locofy respects the way you structure your design and generates code accordingly. So for example, if you have grouped it in a certain way or use frames in a certain way, all of this is going to affect the code. For today's best practices, they are going to help you to get better code. And this works for all the different frameworks. So Locofy supports React, React Native, Next.js, Gatsby, and HTML, CSS. The guidelines and best practices I'll be sharing today will affect and apply to all of the frameworks. And also on top of that, for most of the best practices I'll be sharing today, they are actually very useful in terms of Figma best practices as well. So it's going to help you in the design of it, in the design of your app or website as well. All right, so I'm going to jump into the micro level here. So we're going to start off with some basic building blocks. So things like rectangles and images, text, and so on. So the first item would be the use of images and rectangles and how it affects the structure of buttons, inputs, and cards, right? So over here, you can see that we have a button and it looks like there is a rectangle over here, as you can see, with a text, which is the button text, and it is grouped together with a group. So this is the group icon over here. Now, the first thing that we want to actually consider is that, is this rectangle actually supposed to be a rectangle, or is this kind of a container? So in this case, you might intuitively think that as a button, this orange background here is actually the container for the text inside, in which case this rectangle wouldn't actually be the correct representation of what we think of intuitively. In addition, you will notice that in this button over here, there are 3 layers, whereas in the best practice button, which I'll be sharing with you how we can achieve this, you can see that there are 2 layers. So this is also going to affect the code output because Locofy, as I mentioned earlier on, reads your layer structure. And we are going to assume that you actually are looking for a container instead of a rectangle over here. Okay, so one more thing is that the advantage of having it in this format with a frame in auto layout with text inside is that it's actually responsive to your text, to different contents. So for example, I can change this to contact us, and you can see that our button is automatically resizing. Whereas if we try to edit the text over here, you can see that our design is not actually responding because this rectangle is kind of a separate layer from the text and not acting as a container. So this also is going to help you to structure your Figma design to design even more easily. Right, so let's go through a couple of ways that you can actually convert this layer structure. Give me a second here. Right, so this layer structure into this layer structure. And I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways to do it. First, let's look at how you can build this from scratch. So for example, if you are working with a new design, let's start off by drawing a frame, which is going to be the container. Okay, this is great. Now, we might want to give this a fill. So let's grab this fill color here and paste it. Let's add the fill. Next, we might want a corner radius. So let's grab the corner radius, which is 9. Let's put that in here. And now that we have constructed our frame, let's also add our text inside. So I'll add a text layer and position it inside. Now that we have this as a frame with our text inside, we can add the auto layout property. Perfect. So now, as you can see, when I type inside here, our button is going to resize accordingly. So that is the first way, which I have shared with you, which is to build it from scratch. So if you are working with a new design, we recommend that you do this from the very beginning. Now, let me show you the second way, which is going to be faster. For example, you already have this existing. Here's how you can do it. Let's draw a frame. Now, what you can do is you can actually click on this. Let's click on the rectangle. And we are going to want to copy a couple of properties. Things like fill, border radius. If you have stroke or effects, we can copy everything at once simply by right-clicking over here. Heading to copy properties. You can also use the shortcut. Now let's find our frame, right click, and let's paste the properties. There we go. So you can see that we have done all of those steps in one go by pasting the properties. Now we can simply copy the text over, and with this frame, apply auto layout. Great, perfect. So now we have done it in two different ways. Let me show you the third way. By the way, this second way is actually the foolproof way. I'm going to be showing you the third way. So let's make a copy of it. Now we're going to make use of a Figma function over here. So if you notice the layer structure, we have the group, text, and button. Let's see what happens when I directly apply auto layout. Ta-da! As you can see, we have the structure now in our ideal structure, which is the auto layout frame and text. So as you can see, Figma also understands that this is a I would say better layer structure, a best practice layer structure. So this is what we are trying to achieve. And for most of the cases where you have something simple like this, once again, you can just simply copy it and apply auto layout, and it will help you to do everything. Okay. In the cases where this doesn't work, you can always resort back to the second option, which I'll show you. So this is going to be our button. Now let's see what happens when we tag the button. So let's fire up the Locofy plugin. Great. So remember how we want this button to be an actual working button? Let me show you how we can do that. Simply select the layer, then come over here. Here's where we indicate what kind of element we want to generate the code as. Let's select button. Here you can choose the UI library that you are using. In this case, it's a custom design, so we'll go ahead with none. Great, so here you can add any basic and advanced attributes if required. Next, here is the styling and layouts tab, where you can take care of different media queries, your responsiveness basically, and your button, how your button is going to look across different screen sizes on things like 1200 screen size for desktops, tablets, and mobiles on 428. Here you can also see that we can take care of the different states of the button, like normal states, hover states, press states, and so on. In this case, let's go ahead and add a hover state for this button. So we can change this fill color, for example, and that's it. So now we have added a hover state. In the final tab, which is the actions tab, here you can add actions and take care of user flows, such as change page, scrolling to a different part of the page, and so on. In this case, we have just the button here, so I'll show you maybe about the linking in a later section. Awesome. So now we are done with tagging the button. Our AI has detected some similar buttons. We'll ignore them for now. So here, as you can see, I previewed this, and you'll notice that our button is now working with the hover effects as how we have set it up. Perfect. So this is how you can actually set up your button with the best practices. Let's have a look at another element, which is the input element. Once again, this follows a very similar concept as previously. So you can see that we have created a rectangle with text inside, and then we have grouped them together. So we want to reduce the number of layers and turn it into something like this, where we have our inputs as a auto layout frame with the email text inside. So let's go ahead and do that. If you recall, I showed you 3 steps just now. Let's do the foolproof step first. So simply draw a frame. Then we want to copy all of the properties of our rectangle. In this case, we have a stroke as well, border radius and color. So we'll go ahead and copy all of the properties and then paste it inside of our frame. Perfect. Now we'll add our text inside, and we can apply auto layout. Now you'll notice that Figma has tried to keep the padding same on the left and right, which is why it has shrunk this frame. All you have to do is to simply bring it back to its original size. And that's it. So now we have converted it into our best practice structure. Now let's see if we can use the third option, which was simply to apply auto layout directly. So I'll make a duplicate of this. And you can see here that as I click on add auto layout, it's automatically going to do the same thing. And we can have this just like this. All right, now let's go ahead and tag this as an input to see how it works. So one thing to note is that Locofy is going to pick up the padding settings on your input. So this is our auto layout frame. You can see that we have some padding on the left and on the top, bottom, and on the right. So when we tag it as an input, this is a custom design. So we click on none. Let's run a preview. You can see here that it's going to respect the padding that you have set around. So I could say Isaac Gideon, for example, from Locofy. All right. Now, one thing to note is that when you are building a custom input like this, to be careful that you do not have a very large padding on the right. So Locofy is actually also going to respect this padding that you have added. So in this case, what you notice is that when I preview, the part which you can actually write in is going to be constrained to the part that is within the padding. So that's just something to note when you are actually creating your custom inputs. So I'm going to bring that back. Great. So here we have covered the usage of rectangles in buttons and the usage of rectangles in inputs. Now let's look at the usage of images, for example, in a component like a card. So here we have a card with some text inside and we have an image. So let's look at the layer structure. We have a rectangle image over here with a image fill. Here we have another layer, which is kind of this transparent layer just to make the text more readable. And then finally, we have the text as well. So as you can see, we have 4 layers over here. And this is going to actually generate more lines of code as opposed to our layer structure here with just 2 layers. So how can we reduce the number of layers on our design? Well, first thing we can do is that instead of adding an additional layer of this transparent layer, what we can do is that we can actually grab this fill. So I've selected the fill and I'm going to click on copy. And I can paste this on top of this rectangle with the image. So I'm going to paste the fill. And you can see that we have multiple layers of fill. So I have the added opacity 20% black layer added on top of the image. And in this case, now I would no longer require this additional rectangle 4. So I've deleted that. And you can see we have the exact same design, but now with 1 fewer layer. Now, if you recognize this design, by now you could probably guess that what we could do is we could grab this and simply apply auto layout. Oh, that didn't work. So that is one of the reasons why that is the third option. Sometimes Figma is not going to accurately detect how to convert this into a auto layout frame with text inside. Whenever that happens, you can always revert back to method number 2, which is to simply create your frame, come inside here, copy all the properties, and then paste your properties inside here. Great. Then we can grab this, and there we go. Let's apply auto layout and resize our card. And that's it. So now we have converted it into our best practice layer structure. All right. If you have any questions, please do feel free to leave them in the Q&A section. If there's a relevant one, I might take this immediately. Okay, I'm going to move on right now. So I'm going to look at, so now that we have covered some of the best practices for images, over here and rectangles, I'm going to cover some best practices when it comes to text layers. So the first best practice that I'm going to cover is about the kind of sizing that you choose for your text layer. So here you can see we have two headers. They look very similar, but in actuality, the structure is a little bit different. Here you can see that we have the text. However, due to the fixed size over here, you can see that the bounds of this text layer is actually not exactly where the visual part of the text is. So it's not actually hugging the text. Now, this is not something that you would typically do, but what I've noticed is that sometimes you might, sometimes in the workflow, you might just want to resize this. For example, you want to check if it works on 2 layers or 3 layers, you know, or just one single line, and then you leave it as this, and it will stay as fixed. Now, what's going to happen is that this is going to basically ruin some of the layer structures that we are going to be adding. So for example, here we are going to want to apply auto layout, which is very useful for responsiveness as covered in our previous webinar. And you can see that once we have applied auto layout, over here, the design has been ruined due to the sizes of the text. So instead of that, what we want to do is to ensure that we use the appropriate text size for the text layers. Here you can see that I have a single line of text, so I will choose the auto width setting. This is useful for single lines of text. Same thing over here and over here. So this ensures that what you see is kind of what you get. So you're not misled by the size of this home over here without realizing that the image, the text layer is actually really large. So over here, I'm going to apply auto layout, and you can see that it works beautifully. Let's have another look here at another example. Here you can see a paragraph text where we are using the fixed size. Instead, what we want to do is to actually use the paragraph sizing over here, which is auto height. Now let's see what happens when you use fixed size. So for example, one use case is where you have some contents that you want to populate dynamically. So for example, this text might actually come from your database, and you want this to be flexible for all kinds of different text. So here's what happens when I start to add a few more lines of text. You can see that it maintains the fixed height of 132. So the bounds of our text is actually indicated by this rectangle, whereas our text is actually spilling out over here. So this is not something that you want to do. You might see this and your users might notice this as a bug where your text is running behind your button. So instead, what you like to do is to change this to the auto height setting. And there we go. So now even as we change the size of the text by reducing its content or increasing its content, it's going to automatically adjust the height so that the text actually bounds your text. So do remember to always use the appropriate sizing option for your text. Finally, I just want to point out one little note over here. So this is a setting that sometimes is going to show up in your design as a wrap. So let me just quickly show you. So we have received some feedback from our users where we have noted that, as you can see, this text is a single line on our design, but over here it has wrapped into 2 lines. So let me quickly show you what had caused that. So the reason for this is because for this button, what you see is that it has a very large padding of 80 pixels. So you can see that this little pink highlighted section here is the padding, and this is the padding. So the actual space that is remaining for the text is actually this little bit in the center. So this is kind of invisible in Figma, where the text is just going to remain at this width, so you can't really see it. But when we generate it in code, the padding has to be observed. So it's going to actually wrap into 2 lines. So what you can do to fix this is to simply reduce the padding and ensure that it does not eat into the text. So there we go. I have reduced the padding. And now when we preview this, you're going to find that our button is now looking just as we want it to. All right. So we have covered some of the text layers over here. Now I'm going to go very quickly into one final item for our micro building blocks, and that is the use of lines. So here you can see that we have a design and we have some lines. Now, what you notice in the layer structure is that this is an actual line over here. And we have another line here, line 2, which is this vertical line, and line 3, another vertical line. So you can see that we have a lot of additional layers inside of our panel. And this is all going to be generated inside the code. So one way that we can reduce the number of lines of code is to actually use borders instead of lines. So let me show you how you can do that. You can see here that for this summary section, we have applied a border on top. And that's how we had gotten this line. So I'll show you how I built that step by step. First, let's delete this line. Then we can click on this and apply our stroke. Then instead of having it on all 4 sides, let's just put it on top and we can correct the color. And there we go. So now we have used a border instead of a line. We can do the same for these other 2 lines, which I will delete. So let's grab this middle section here and we can add our stroke. We can do the left side. And similarly here, let's add a stroke and keep it on the left. And that's it. So with this, we have also reduced the number of layers that is required for our design, and it's going to result in a lot cleaner code. All right, great. So now that we have looked at some of the smaller items, I'll just do a quick recap. So when we are looking at images and buttons, do always remember to consider if you are intending to use them as a shape or a image, or if you are intending to use the shape as a container instead of a shape, right? So for example, in this button. So that is one thing to consider for using these elements, these layers. Next, we have text layers, best practices. So do remember to always use the correct with setting and ensure that you have enough padding and space for your text to breathe. Finally, do remember that if possible, if you are using borders, if you're using your lines in place of borders, you should actually use the borders instead and delete the line layers. Great. So let's move on to a slightly larger few items, things like buttons and headers and other kinds of components like cards and so on. So I'm going to be showing you how we can build a slightly more scalable design system by using components. So what are components? If you're new to Figma, components are basically elements that you can reuse across your designs, and you can create and manage consistent designs across your entire project. So let's look at some of the benefits of using components. For example, we have this button over here. And if we do not use a component and we make a few copies of these, you can see that when I change the design of one button, it's not going to work for the other buttons. Whereas with components, this is a component, and you can see it over here with the purple diamond icon. As I create some copies of this component, when I change the design of this one, it's going to affect all of our other components. So the main advantage is that whatever you do to the parent component is also going to be applied to the children component. Now, this is going to be very useful. As you had seen just now, we had done some corrections to the layer structure of our buttons. Now, if you had done it with components, you just need to correct the layer structure for just one element, and it would apply to all of your other elements. This is also going to work for Locofy properties. So not just the ones you see on Figma, like fill, color, border radius, and so on. Inside of Locofy properties as well, you can see here that we have these items, and here I have tagged it as a button. Now let's add a hover effect. And you can see that as I add a hover effect, this is going to apply for not just this button, but for all of the instances as well. Right? So let me just quickly change the hover effect to a different color, and you can see that, let's say blue, for example. Now all of our buttons have the blue hover effects. So this is going to be very useful when applying Locofy settings as well. Now let's have a quick look at another component, and I'll show you how you can actually create and reuse components. So here we have a navigation bar. You can see that this is not a component. It has the auto layout icon. To create a component is very easy. Simply right click on your layer and then choose this option, create component. And now this is a component as indicated by the purple outline. You can easily make copies of this by duplicating this. And you can see here, we have another component, but this is an instance of the parent component. Perfect. So once more, I'll show you another reason why it's useful to create components. So for example, you can see that this might be used on different pages, and we might want to apply some Locofy settings to this. So let's head into preview. You can see that it is responsive, but on a smaller device, the padding over here is slightly too large. So we might want to reduce this on smaller screen sizes. With this, you can do this with the Locofy plugin. So let's go ahead and tag this here as a container. And inside the stylings and layouts tab, you can see that we have the padding values here, which are at 200. Now, for example, we want this padding to be smaller on a smaller device. We can try to edit it on the 1200 device size. So let's reduce this to 60, for example. So what this means is that when the screen size is 1200 or less, the padding is going to be 60. And on the default size, it's still going to be 200. So let's check that out. So there we go. When the screen size is reduced to less than 1200, you can see that the padding has also reduced. Now, this setting is also going to be applied to our other component instance, which we had created. So once again, do remember to use your components for any items that you want to repeat across your designs. It's just going to make it more flexible whenever you want to add changes on Figma and Figma properties, as well as Locofy properties. All right, so that is for components. Now let's move out to the macro level, which is to look at a full design. All right, so I'm going to be sharing with you some of the best practices for structuring your design. And this is important, as we had shared just now. Locofy is going to read your structure in order to generate code, and you can get very different code based on how you have structured your design. So here are some of the best practices. The first best practice is to remove unnecessary groups or frames. Now, let me show you an example. Here you can see that we have this flexibility and options text, and it's actually wrapped in a bunch of groups over here. So these groups may not be very useful for your design. It's not actually serving much of a purpose. However, this is actually going to generate many additional lines of code. So what you want to do is that if the group is not actually doing anything like helping you to structure your elements, then what you can do is to remove these groups. So you can do so easily by right-clicking and clicking on ungroup. Or you can use the shortcut. On Mac, it would be Command Delete. So I'll just do that a couple of times. As you can see, our design had no changes, and we had managed to get rid of a couple of layers, which is going to improve our code. Next, you can also remove unnecessary frames. So similar to groups, you might have frames that are not performing much of a purpose over here. So we can also go ahead to remove these. Perfect. So there we go. That is the first best practice that we would like to share for structuring your design. Next is to use frames instead of groups. So why would we prefer to use frames instead of groups? Is because frames can actually do everything that groups can do and more. And in general, frames respond better when we are applying auto layout, which is useful when we want to add responsiveness. This is something we had covered in more detail in our previous webinar, which we were talking about responsiveness. So where you have frames and you want to, when you have groups and you want to convert them into frames, you can do so easily. So for example, we might want to put these two together. So I'm going to add a group. And here we can convert this group into a frame by simply clicking on group, change that to a frame. Alternatively, we can also, instead of grouping it from the start, we can just right click and frame the selection instead. So that is using groups instead of frames. Next, we also want to ensure that we frame up items according to the different sections. Now, you can see here in this design that we actually have our items strewn all around the place. So we have our individual items like this over here. Here as well, you can see these items are all individually placed. So what happens is that in the layer structure, you can see that they are all, it's a very flat structure with everything directly inside of the parents container. Now what we'd like to do is to actually have them structured in a more organized fashion and apply some sort of hierarchy in our structure. This is going to be useful in code as well as in the design. So for example, we might want to deal with this section as a section. So what we can do is we can select all the elements here, including the image, and apply a frame around it. And that helps us to add some structure so we know, okay, this is a header section. So it helps you to organize in Figma, and inside of code, you will also get more well-structured code. This is useful, especially when you might want to reuse this as well in a different section. You can simply just copy that across, right? So here, I'll just quickly also go ahead and frame up a few of these other sections. So I simply click the frame tool and draw a frame around the elements. What this does is that it will place all of these elements directly inside of the frame that we had drawn around it. So we can do the same for these as well. Now, one thing to note when you are framing up your elements is that you might also want to look out for things which have been previously grouped or framed wrongly. Let me give you an example. For example, if I had previously had all of these elements in a group, so let me group them together. And I had made some, let's say I made some changes to this design. So for example, I no longer want this to be facts. I'm going to delete it. And I want this to instead be another phone number. So I will make a copy here. So what you notice is that this phone icon is actually going to be separate from our initial group that we had created. So you might not notice this at the start, but it's going to affect the layer structure. So when you are going about to frame up your items, do also be sure to check out the existing groups to make sure that you have them in the correct structure. So in this case, we are going to want to ungroup this and then group them together again as a frame. Great. So another thing is that we can go in further and we might realize that, hey, we want these items to be, separate from this logo over here. So we can actually also select these items and apply a group to it. Sorry, I mean a frame to it. Great. So we can go into our design and start to frame up items according to different sections. They can be big sections like these, and it could be smaller sections like this as well. We can even break this into even smaller sections like this for even more structure. Now, this is also going to be useful for our next tip, which is to apply auto layout and responsiveness constraints. So let me show you over here. We have this design, and as we resize this frame, it is not going to be responsive. What we can do is we can apply auto layout. And now you can see that this is in auto layout. We can apply a responsiveness constraint to keep this gap responsive. So I'm going to apply this space between setting. What this does is that this gap here is going to be responding according to the size of the container. So now we have this responsive, which is also another reason why we had wanted to group this as one section to keep them on the right and group this as another, or just leave this by itself to keep this on the left. So what you notice is that if you have followed step 3 to frame up items accordingly to different sections, when you apply auto layout, it's going to be very easy. Now, one more tip when applying auto layout, you can start to apply them from inside out. So for example, we have this section here. If we apply auto layout directly, you can see that since they are placed as individual elements, auto layout is going to start to want to force them into either a column or a row. So what we can do instead is to start to apply auto layout from the inside out. So we might want this as a row. These two elements, I'll apply auto layout here. Then these two could also be auto layout as a row. Next, these two items. And then now when we apply auto layout to this outer section, you can see that it is working perfectly. So to learn more about how you can do responsiveness, you can see here, it's not fully responsive yet. I just need to add a couple of constraints like fill container. Similarly here. And you can see that we have our responsive design. And this is going to be accordingly reflected in the Locofy plugin. So let me bring that out. And open up the Locofy plugin. Here you'll notice that it's going to be equally responsive. Let me see what happened there. Right, this should be fill container. All right, perfect. So to learn more about responsiveness and a few more details about how we managed to achieve this, you can check out our previous webinar. We are going to be dropping a link in the description, in the chat right after this webinar. All right, so we have covered the best practices for structuring your design. Now, the final item that we are going to be covering today is going to be about layer naming. So let's have a look at our design again. If you notice on the layers panel, we have layer names such as frames over here. So what happens is that Locofy is actually going to read the layer names that you have written in order to generate things like class names, component names, prop names, and so on. So if you have explicitly indicated a name in the layer, then Locofy is also going to use that to help generate your code. So for example, we might call this the header section, and that would be good. Over here, we might want to call this a card, and this might be a card row. Now, if you explicitly define the layer name, then Locofy is going to take reference from that. If you leave it just as frame, then Locofy is going to try its best, and we will smartly try to generate layer names based on other elements inside. So for example, if you have a property card here, Locofy might detect this as a property card parent and automatically generate for you this as the name in the code. All right, so that is for adding layer names in order to get better code. So one thing to note is that if you are duplicating your elements, you should try to name them first and then duplicate them so that you don't have to rename your layers. All right, so we have covered the best practices. Now I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of exciting updates. So Locofy is actually working right now on a feature to help you to implement these best practices. So soon we will have a feature that is going to scan through your design and detect items like buttons. Over here, remember we had to apply a couple of steps. Instead, Locofy is actually going to detect all of these layer structures and recommend that you fix them. And you can accept the recommendation by clicking a fix button. So we'll be rolling out a feature that detects things like these buttons, images. We will also help to detect things like redundant layers where you had added many groups. For example, things like this. So we can actually scan through to help you to reduce the number of redundant layers and improve your code quality. So this is something that you can use right now in your designs, but do stay tuned for our upcoming updates where we will be starting to automate many of these processes. Thank you very much for joining us again. If you do have ideas for other topics that you are keen on learning more about, please do let us know. You can reach us in our Slack channel. You can also reach us via email, and we are available in all these channels to listen and hear what kind of tutorials, guides, webinars you'd like to see. Thank you once again, and we will be ending the webinar now. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.